Welcome both via Zoom as well at the Academy to tonight's Max Beckmann lecture, Methods of Inquiry 1965 to Present by Gary Kuehn. Gary is very special because he has not come alone to the Academy. He has brought his wife, Suzanne McConnell, who will be giving a lecture about her work with Kurt Vonnegut next week. And it's not only a treat, it's an honor to have you both here. And you are what I usually call the buy one, get one free model, 2 in 1 room. That's excellent. Gary is our 5th Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitor, and we are grateful to Marion Beckmann for all her valuable advice and support for this program, which was established in 2017. Our thanks also go to the supporters of the program. 2 of them are here with us tonight, Klaus Heiliger and Marie-Blanche Callier. Thank you so very much. When our first Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitor, Carrie James Marshall, was here at the Academy, Marion also played a key role. She hosted a small reception at her house. And welcomed us with all her warmth, which we really appreciate, but she also introduced me to 2 Zwirners. And those 2 Zwirners have added so much to this program, ranging from artwork to advice. And the first conversation I had with both of them, Dorothea and Rudolf, that evening was all about freedom, a theme that is also central in Gary's work. From there, from our conversation about freedom, a friendship developed that has been most valuable to me, and I cannot express how meaningful it is, Gary's stay in this context here at the Academy. So thank you, all the 4 who are here in the first row. And thank you, Rudolf, for planting the seed. We know that you are excellent in that. And thank you, Dorothea, for leading to tonight's discussion with Gary. Everybody knows Dorothea as a first-rate art historian and as a contributing writer to Der Tagesspiegel. She's an expert on Marcel Brotas and has published about Rodney Graham, Polly Meller, among others. Most recently, however, she has published Thea Sternheim, Chronistin der Moderne, with Wallstein Publishers. And your homework for after this talk is you go home and then you either order this book online or tomorrow morning you go to a bookshop and then you buy it. I promise that I do not promise too much. However, her most important work is actually this. Gary Kuehn, 5 Decades, where she elaborates on Gary's work and where Gary also so eloquently says, what it's really about, I quote, what it's really about is how many ways things can fall apart, what holds things together, end quote. This is a central question when we think about humanity and also the broader context of our lives. And it is an honor to have you, Gary, to reflect further on this with Dorothea tonight. Before I turn over to you, Dorothea, let me briefly explain the structure of the evening as we are joined by the world via Zoom. Dorothea, as all of you know, we are extremely we have an Academy obsession with introductions. So Dorothea will introduce Gary and then we'll be in conversation with him here on stage. After that, all of you who are here are most kindly invited to join the discussion and ask questions. A colleague of mine will pass around a microphone. Please continue to wear your mask when you ask questions. And our audience from Zoom is also most kindly invited to ask questions. You will be able to type in your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, and Dorothea will be reading your questions to Gary. We apologize in advance if not all questions can be answered. Disclaimer. So, Dorothea, thank you so much. The floor is yours, and welcome again, Gary. Ich nehme mir das hier alles mit.
Yeah, thank you, Berit, for this kind introduction, and also from my part, a warm welcome to all of you. I have the honor to introduce my dear friend Gary Kuehn to you. I know Gary now for more than 30 years. It was maybe 1986 or 87 I was a young student of art history in Cologne when I first met him and his wife Suzanne in the house of my future husband Rudolf Zwirner. From this very moment on, I followed his artistic career with ongoing curiosity and fascination. I wrote some smaller texts about his work, and we became close friends, spending every summer together in our summer houses in Wellfleet, Cape Cod. And here are some other friends who joined these summer vacations. 10 years ago, Gary asked me if I was willing to conceive and write his first comprehensive monograph, enabled by his two German gallerists, Michael Haas, who is here tonight, and Wolfgang Häusler. I immediately agreed, and we had 2 wonderful years of an intense exchange of thoughts, all introduced into the book Gary Kuehn, 5 Decades, you just saw. For almost 6 decades now, Gary Kuehn has been occupied with the artistic problem of form and freedom, which he first encountered as a fine art student in his early 20s at Rutgers University in New Jersey, after receiving his bachelor degree in art history from Drew University in 1962, and before teaching himself at Rutgers for more than 40 years. Coming from a working-class family, he also spent many years laboring on construction sites to cover the costs for his education and his young family. His humble origins, coupled with a constant shifting between the freedom of art school and the necessity of earning a living, have given Gary Kuehn's work a down-to-earth touch all along. Not only does this blur the boundaries between fine arts and crafts, but also engenders an overall tension that causes opposites to collide. Embedded within the historical antagonism between abstract expressionism and minimalism, Gary Kuehn finds himself perpetually returning to the question, oh, I can take this off, to the question of the extent to which this tension can be borne, reconciled, or even heightened, and hence to the question of what can hold a given form together or cause it to collapse. For Gary, the Faustian urge to know what binds the world with all its seeds and sources and innermost life goes hand in hand with the threat of its collapse. In the tension between constructive and deconstructive forces, Gary never tires of trying to sound out the scope and limits of human activity. The intimate connection between an artist's creative production and biography seems to me to be especially important in the case of Gary Kuehn, whose works often reveal autobiographical traits, though their formal vocabulary is abstract. In Gary Kuehn's practice, the cause of his work dovetails with the cause of his life in a manner that also finds expression in his commentaries and metaphorical poetic titles. Moreover, with his fine sense of language and capacity for self-analytical reflection, the artist indicates his interest in psychoanalysis, behavioral theory, mythology, and literature. With the appropriate interpretive approaches, the individual groups of works can be construed as variations on a theme revolving around the central human question of freedom. Thank you. So, Gary, let's start with the first question. Coming from a working class family, was there any experience with art? Where does your interest in art come from? How did you come up with the idea of studying art history and later on art? Was there any key moment or key figure Was there any support or rather opposition in your family? Or to put it even more general, who becomes an artist?
I guess that's the most interesting question is who becomes an artist? I think this is a ponderous thing for anyone aspiring in that direction to self-nominate. It's a self-nominating decision, and it's a decision that can haunt you for the rest of your life. I had students who were humbled by the fact that their dads might have been brain surgeons, successful brain surgeons, and they would be discouraged and feeling they had aimed lower. And I would always say, you have a much harder job. You don't know if you're succeeding. You don't know if you're failing. You don't know if you're coming or going. You don't know what the questions are, because there are no questions. You have to make the questions and proceed from there. And there's no real way to test yourself again, except perhaps against the system, the art world. And I wouldn't say that's a very reliable way to measure yourself or test yourself. In terms of my own background, it's a curious mix. I'm from a very left-wing family. My father was a member of the American Communist Party as a machinist, disaffected, I want to say in advance, by the purges in '52, but in the meantime, he was a union organizer and so forth. I grew up in this milieu, and the instability of it and the FBI surveillance, which gave me a bit of paranoia that I never outgrew. I'm still paranoid about the system in a general sense, although I've managed to accommodate to it. So I'm not sure what that has to do with the issue, but it's certainly a part of my makeup. We were poor, but I don't think that's a distinguishing thing.
But in terms of their support of your interest in art,
their interest came more from the fact that as a kid I had tuberculosis. I missed a year of school, and while my playmates were out playing, I was confined. I never had to be committed to a sanitarium, but I was more or less out of commission for a year. So I drew, I read ahead of my time in a certain way, and I guess it just pushed me in that direction. And as I got older, recovered and had a paper route. I would use my money to take drawing classes from a lady in the neighborhood who taught drawing, and then I was very keen on being a normal teenager and so forth. And when I went to university, I studied art history. I didn't have originally the idea of being an artist, and so I pursued that course of study. And fortuitously, I met George Siegel, who I got to know quite well. He was really a mentor for me, and he said, Gary, you don't have the discipline for it. Why don't you go to art school? Why don't you come to Rutgers? Where he was also a student, by the way. He was tired of being a chicken farmer and a high school teacher. So he was getting an MFA because it was a requirement for teaching in university. And so we were classmates, even though he had already established quite a reputation. And I just got hooked on it, and the nobility, the grandness of, and the impertinence of being an artist just caught me, and it caught me at a historical moment.
Gary, maybe let's stay a while at Rutgers University. You met there with other artists like Alan Capro and Robert Watts, who were co-founders of the Fluxus movement.
I was trying to speed it up a little bit. Okay, I'll slow down. I'll tell you. I wanted to have Dorothea as an anchor because I'm very inclined to go off in a particular direction, and her job is to reel me back in. So how I got into Rutgers, Siegel told me there was a Meyer Shapiro lecture and that we should go to it. So at the lecture was Alan Capra, Roy Liechtenstein, the Fluxus artist Robert Watts, and Jeffrey Hendricks, a couple of other professors whose I've forgotten. And I was 22 or 23 years old with these artists sitting in a bar having a beer, and Siegel said, "You just go to this." I can't even remember exactly how it happened, but he said, "So you get into school this way." So after a couple of weeks after this event, I called Siegel up and said, "George, what's the story with Rutgers?" He said, "What do you mean, what's the story? You're in. Just go down there." So I got in the car, and there was no real formal application for it, but they sized me up and decided that I was material for that I had enough commitment, enough seriousness that they picked up here and there, and the situation was very egalitarian. There were no real classes. And you were expected to be, you were an artist. You weren't a student, and so you didn't ask things. You were on the same playing field as the rest of them, which, as a 22-year-old, put enormous pressure on.
How about Liechtenstein, for example?
Well, Liechtenstein, you want me to tell this one? Yeah, this is very good. I worked with Roy, and and I was playing around between painting and sculpture, more a sculptor because of my construction work background, but I tried being a painter also. And at some point, Roy cornered me and he said, "Kuehn, you're hopeless in terms of painting. Just do whatever you want." And but he was supportive at the same time, and told me, from his perspective, I didn't have much potential as a painter. So this pushed me in the direction of sculpture, and I start out, you need material. I had no money. I had a young family to take care of, so I was doing at the same time this heavy construction work, either structural steel or roofing work, and I was getting both my material as scraps from these job sites, and then putting it to use for the art ideas that were relevant at the time, not just for me, but I would say for a whole generation of artists that came to be associated with the process and material manner of working.
So then we come to your first group show that was at the Fischbach Gallery in New York, curated at the time by Lucy Lippert, and it was entitled Eccentric Abstraction. And this show included artists like Louise Bourgeois and Eva Hesse and Bruce Nauman, Kissonnier and others. Although this term eccentric abstraction failed to catch on, the observations and considerations associated with it are highly pertinent for exactly what you described for your work. So Lippert used the term to designate a form of abstraction that excluded neither experience nor imagination and rejected the sanctity of pure form. So you have used a similar wording when you said, I compromise pure forms. So I think this is very typical for you. Could you explain that with regards to your early sculptures?
I would, if I could go back and explain the larger cultural situation. I think that the work of Donald Judd represented a kind of a wall against which you couldn't really go any further. You were going to be a follower or just more or less that. There were no real potential for it. And on the other side, subjectivity and abstract expressionist dependence on aesthetic judgment and this sort of thing didn't really satisfy anymore, and it had kind of run out of gas as an option. So there had to be another way of working. I combined my experience as a construction worker, my skill handling material, my knowing the limits of material help you. I discovered, wait a minute, there is expression here. There is the possibility of expression in bending a piece of steel, of even the simple thing of breaking a piece of wood over your knee and having it splintered but not quite broken. This was expression. This was a new way to think about expression that importantly didn't have anything particularly personal about it. It could be expressive without having the artist's authorship. And this was really the key to a new way of working, to find the expressive qualities in material and combinations of material and ways of putting things together, of either, mostly it was involved in destroying and compromising pure forms, but on the other side I would say, let's give it a break and sanctify geometry, because I have a boundless respect for rationality, geometry, and I mean, our whole tradition is based on these principles, and at the same time, the other side of this issue is us as humans who we're not so sure of what our nature is. Are we good? Are we rational? Are we honorable? Are we violent? Are we thieves? Are we? It gave the other side of this. Are we destructive? I think you can say all those things. We really can be destructive. We can be noble, but we can also be vicious and destructive. So I didn't want to speak about specific works. That's why we're running this stream like this, because I don't want to analyze my own work and speak about piece by piece. But I think if you look at the works as they play off, you begin to see my working method where I could do something and it's boundlessly expressive, and I can disavow. I can say it didn't happen. Can I tell the Wolfgang Becker?
We come to this
okay.
in a moment. You know, obviously, you from early on, you got a certain recognition of what you were doing there. So in 1967, you had your first solo exhibition at the Bianchini Gallery in New York and at Rolf Ricke in Kassel. So this is quite a success for a 28-year-old or better young artist. So how did this happen at you?
there was an article. It was a kinder, gentler art world, I have to say, for those of you who are familiar with the ins and outs of the art world. It was much smaller, and there was less commercial potential at the time. So I had an article published in Studio International, a British magazine, which what you almost never would get now, 5 or 6 pages with half a dozen, I can't remember, reproduced images, and it caught the eye of any number of European gallerists who started to open up in the time between Europe and America, and I got a couple of requests for a visit, and one was from Rolf Ricke, who went to the Bianchini Gallery, saw my exhibition, asked if it would be possible to meet me, and the woman who was the director of the gallery at the time said, sure, I was living on a rented farm out in western Jersey, really shabby place, but it had big barns and so forth that made excellent studios, and there was an abundance of material around. Anyway, Ricke came out, visited, and we hit it off, and he bought a couple of pieces from me, a couple of sculptures from me, and invited me to come to Germany. He was then in Kassel, and I accepted, but I was also skeptical, and I went to the West Coast and visited my brother who was living in San Francisco during the Haight-Ashbury time. When I came home, there was a ticket in the mailbox. I'd never been out of the country. I didn't have a passport. I had a quick go to Rockefeller Center where you could, if you would wait in line, you could get a passport in a day. And I went to Ricke's. It was really a profound, just the travel for a young American guy who's not from a particularly cultured and traveled family. It was terrifying and exciting.
And as far as I know, you were invited to do a show with the gallery,
I did a show,
but you didn't bring the work. So
no, I didn't bring. No, Ricke bought some pieces. We showed those. I did some drawings there, but it gave him the idea for the next show, which we did in Cologne, where it was clear that the transport would be impossible. The cost of the transport would be impossible. And he said, how about you come to Germany, we get the material and make the pieces here. He found me a studio. He was one of my best assistants, the gallerist. He'd be happy to drive all over the Rhineland to find the right kind of material for me. And I had a show here, and then the play between my ideas that I would bring with me, said I'll make these pieces, and I would get here, and the experience would lead me somewhere else. So it was really a kind of cross-pollination, because when I would get home, I would have ideas in Germany that I would execute in New York. So it became this crossover experience that was effective and productive for me for years, really for years to come.
I think this is quite remarkable for an artist to not to be invited with this specific group of works, but to have a free card to just produce whatever. And this was obviously very successful, because you, after this second show with Rolf Ricke in Cologne, you were invited by Harald Seemann to participate in a group show at the Kunsthalle Bern. And the title of this legendary show was When Attitudes Become Form in 1969. And this title reads like the program of a whole generation of artists whose members were less interested in form as such than in process of its becoming. So one aspect of this attitude is to avoid aesthetic decisions. So isn't it the job of an artist to make aesthetic decisions?
I think that when the art makes the decision, it has more authority when the material and the art makes the decision for you. I began to see myself more clearly as a kind of unmoved mover whose job it was to set up a situation with material and allow the sculpture to make itself. And my position then would be to either accept or reject the results of the pieces that I felt didn't come off to my satisfaction, would just wind up on the sculpture junk pile. Maybe the material would be used again for another purpose, but yeah, and this goes back to the question of this suspicion I had about the aesthetic judgments of the abstract expressionists, and the fact that they were about taste and a little bit wishy-washy and effete and all that. I like the toughness of the material having the authority and the power to make the decision. It seemed more persuasive, more powerful than my decisions of taste. So it really became a mode of working that served me, and even later on, to this day, I still very much count on this as a working method, or not as purely as I did in this 60s and 70s period.
So that brings me to the next group of works, the gesture project. So the overall shift in focus from the result to the process, discerned and explored by Harald Seemann in his Attitude exhibition, found a suitable forum in the Fernsehgalerie, Gary Kuehn's groundbreaking television gallery. So this was established in Berlin in 1968, and the project was subsequently relocated to Düsseldorf, and where it ran under the name of Videogalerie Kuehn from 71 to 73. So there was a first exhibition about land art, and then a second exhibition featured Gary with his gesture project, joined by artists like Anselmo, Boetti, Joseph Beuys, Merz, Rutenbeck, Saunier, and so on. So what was your contribution to this exhibition, and what is your gesture project?
The gesture project, it jumps back to the 60s, actually. The sculpture was my main activity, but I was as well concerned with like what a drawing could be without being expressive, in the sense that I've already emphasized I'm kind of against. So I would start out with a stencil of a square rectangular format, and then just thrash around in the space with a number 4 pencil, bouncing against one edge or the next. The point being finally that the gesture, the expressive gesture, could only go to the edge of the square stencil, and there seemed something fascinatingly fatalistic about this, and the fact that it thwarts any notion of freedom, or the idea that when you come to the edge of canvas, it goes on imaginary space. I wanted really to have this physical confinement, and this gave rise to myriad of approaches to drawing that had no sentiment, no human thing except the confinement and the denial of the free gesture. For the Gary Kuehn piece, it was basically that idea done in real time. Gary Kuehn set up the camera in a format he constructed so that the focus of the lens was exactly on, I don't remember the technique of it, but the square, and I could make this with sound also, which is very nice. With the felt pen, you'd have the squeak and it would end in the click of it hitting the edges. It's futile, the futility of it. I mean, another group that I called futile exercises that are similar, but they're very, in some sense, pessimistic works. On another level, you could say there's a certain dignity in fighting a fight that you're going to lose, that there's no way you're going to win it. And that is the nobility of a futile cause interested me. This goes back, I'd say that's a kind of autobiographical giveaway to tell you something like that. That I'm, this is the mindset that I live with and live by.
Yeah, so obviously you always like to work with the confrontation of antithesis, of contrasts. So as in this case, gesture and mathematical logic and principles of geometry. Another contrast in your work is the antagonism between painting and sculpture, polarity influencing the development of your work as a whole since the early 60s. Especially if I think about the black paintings, begun in 1971 and continued 30 years later, revolving around formal oppositions, surface and space, black and white, figure versus ground, circle versus rectangle. So how do you produce these black paintings? We saw some of them already. And why did you choose black? So what's the story about the black paintings?
No references, really. I mean, black, there's a tradition of black from Malevich to, it contrasts figure and ground with, I think, any color has overtones of metaphor, symbolism, whatever, and I wanted to avoid that completely. So the black was the only possibility. With the black paintings, did we come to any black paintings yet? No. Yeah. So. In the beginning, I mainly used a square format and a stencil. It was a thin banding material, steel wire banding material. And I would push against the edge of the format and then fill in the figure, the black area, with paint, a thinned acrylic paint that was applied with a turkey baster from cooking, because I didn't want to have gesture. I was very, very, very against the notion of a gesture, which is putting energy in a particular direction. I just wanted to fill the space in this oozing out until it comes to its edge. Very pessimistic works in a certain way, or noble in another way to look at it. But in each case, the figure works however it is against the format, either to push so that it almost is a black painting, except the edge doesn't go into the corner. It can't quite obliterate the ground, the white, and that would be the extreme of it. Others are figures, so it's biomorphic things, maybe. Some of them, I think, are fairly erotic. Some of them are outrageously erotic, if you care to look at them in that way. But they, in each case, have an authority. In each case, they're playing against that absolute format. And this continues to occupy me.
So you once pointed out that you, I quote, you lay claim to social and psychological implications. So linguistic approximations of your works, such as pressure and tension, adaptation, restriction, deformation, and expansion, necessarily lead us from a descriptive to a metaphorical level. So what are the social and psychological implications of your work?
How far do I want to go with this one? Yeah, I already said I think that implied in everything is the question of the limit of our freedom. And that means all of us, not just me. I happen to focus on it. I think that's probably the strongest thing, and the tension that we live under, the explosive nature of decisions we make in life, that there's an overall control of those things that cries out for some demonstration. I mean, it's maybe a little bit easier to write about it, these things, but I choose to demonstrate them in a physical way. It's like the dominance of in what I'm sure passed by would be a steel piece, which everyone knows is a stronger material than aluminum. I would start with the clamp and clamp it, then move the clamp along. The aluminum always submits to the form of the steel, usually the circle, and then you wind up with a kind of deformation, which the flip side of that is something maybe graceful, a graceful kind of surrender. So I'm interested in these things that are beautiful in their failure, and poetic in their failure as well as their success.
So I think quite typical for you in this sense is also the use of stencils as both as functional and aesthetic components. So with their cut-out templates, stencils not only have a technical function, but also a certain metaphorical significance and account on their preformed pattern. So once again, the implicit dialectic of free will and determination as embodied by the stencils emerges as a central paradigm in your works. So when did you come up with these stencils, and where do you use them in
by the way, for our audience, I can just out of the corner of my eye see that these are exactly the pieces that Dorothea stole, the copper pieces and so forth. This is coincidental. We didn't stage this. It just happened. I would have an idea of the copper piece where the line goes up and down, and it's cut out of the copper in a very regular way. Okay, this one as well. I make a gesture. It's clear it starts with the free gesture, and then the gesture's eviscerated by having been made into a stencil, and then you have this format. What can you do? But this same gesture again, and the futility of it, and the nobility of wanting to repeat it and know that it's like in compulsive in analytic or therapeutic terms, the repetition compulsion, or something like that, it becomes really evident. So that setup interests me a lot. Also, that you do something and it has spontaneity, and then you see the trap of it, and that the piece becomes about something else that I think is social, psychological, and in some way maybe realistic but deeply depressing. And they're really, for me, loaded psychologically.
So as for many other American artists, your career has really taken off from Germany. So you had your gallery in Cologne, your first institutional show in Aachen, 1970, a teaching job in Braunschweig, 1970-71, and a DAAD scholarship and residency in Berlin, 1979-1980. So what was your experience in Germany in general and in Berlin in particular?
So I started from another angle. And I don't want to ingratiate myself because I'm in Germany with a lot of German friends and supporters. But I mean, I figured out at some point that I am German American, and when I was studying art history, I was actually drawn to the art of Northern Europe as opposed to what everyone else was fascinated with, the Italian, Southern European art, and the psychological tension in the work just caught me, and so I feel myself. I'm German American, but I feel very strongly this German sensibility. Now, but again, I don't want to try to ingratiate myself in some way, but I just feel that, and I feel comfortable working here, and I feel especially grateful for the social culture. You know, I started to come here in '66, and Germany was just putting itself back together at that time, and it seemed to be a good place to be. And I had so much support from and interest from the class of people who would support art, were really interested in art. I'd say would be, professional people that doesn't exist in America. I mean, a lawyer, a doctor, or whatever in America, they rather have a boat and a painting. And I just found that I have to tell the story of Dr. Hunstein. Can I tell this? There's a dentist in Kassel. This was on one of my first trips, and he was very engaged with music, and he would, not just me, but all the artists, I know Saunier, Barry Laval, would go have dinner at his house, and were really unused to this. You go to Dr. Hunstein, and he's very warm, and he said, "Come on, before we get started, downstairs." We knew we all had bad teeth, so you jump in the dentist's chair, and he gives you an examination. He says, "You have one bad cavity," so he fills the cavity, and he said, "Okay, now we're ready to go." You go up and have dinner and drink, and then, we're not that cultured Americans, so we get introduced to music and so forth. And I have so many experiences like that. It was so comfortable to be here. I don't know that many Americans like this. So it just is. Maybe you don't even know it yourselves. You're very art friendly, very art supportive. Yeah.
So we come to the 80s, and there I see quite a change in your work. There's a tendency towards content and mythology. So starting with your sculpture, Mythic Responsibility, that we see now here. This is 1976. And I'm thinking about then the pickaxe pieces we saw some, and the figurative paintings and mythological sculptures. So what are the topics and sources of inspiration for these works? And maybe you can explain it in terms of this particular sculpture.
Yeah, we agreed on this ahead of time. I'm not so interested in talking about specific works. I'd rather they all speak for themselves, but I agreed with Dorothea to speak about this, and there are subsequent works that it didn't show. At some point, I felt the need to be in the work myself, and this came from years of psychotherapy or therapy, whatever. I've done this off and on all my life. In fact, I just did it again at 80 to 82 and stopped it. I very strongly believe in with the pro sorting these things out. It's not a crisis. It's a luxury to engage in enterprise like this with when you're not in a particular crisis. You just want to find something out. And I had this fear and rejection of figuration. Nevertheless, from mythology, I had an interest in specific figures and so forth, just on a kind of intellectual level. And so how to manage it, how to do it. And then suddenly it came to me I could make a figurative piece, not necessarily a human figure or a self-portrait or human figure. And I got these animals and cut their heads off, and then as soon as I began to think about what I had just done, I had deprived them of the capability of rational thinking. And then the next step, when there's no rational thinking possibility, what can then they could maybe support some eternal figure like a triangle that's so symbolically loaded in every way for many religions and so forth. And that's it. It doesn't require reason. It's a fundamental of faith and I don't want to say humanity of faith, just the responsibility for this notion of rationality without even possessing the capability of grasping it. So obviously I put the hooks in the neck and did the triangle. So the triangle holds the three figures. I was easy enough with it all along, and at some point it came to me that they're really self-portraits, myself times three, holding this figure that I revere on the one side and I'd attacked so often at other times that it was a kind of quiet, some people would say brutal work, but for me it has a tranquility that gives me some quiet peace. And so that was my dabbling in figuration. Then I did other paintings which I decided not to include, where there are figures, women holding a fish, and then it's like playing around with a very strong symbol and the notion of female on a large sense, and the whole question of the fish. And this leads me into, once I have an idea like this, it leads me into research that doesn't validate or invalidate anything I did, but I just realized I'd come on something that's loaded, psychologically loaded, mythologically loaded, but it was a little bit a side track from my normal way of thinking and what I call my red thread. So I dropped it, and I didn't want to confuse. I don't want to confuse my audience by.
That leads to my last question, because there's another rather unusual confrontation you like to locate your sculptures in, and this is between sex and geometry. So it seems to me as a confrontation between the formal and the metaphorical level, as you described it, and where nature and culture, irrationality and reason, excess and control, freedom and determination compete with one another. So do you agree in these oppositions, or could you explicate it in your words, sex and geometry? What do you mean with this?
I had an exhibition in Zurich, and I wanted to, I think it was either Munich or Zurich, and I wanted to title the exhibition Between Sex and Geometry. It turned out that the gallery didn't have the courage, or thought it was a bad idea to title an exhibition Between Sex and Geometry, but Christiane Meyerstol, the curator of the Kunstmuseum Liechtenstein, went for my title. So I had a really major exhibition entitled Sex and Geometry. And in Liechtenstein, there are 3 or 4 newspapers, so you can be sure you get on the front page of every newspaper. But not only that, they took the drawing that it was taken from, they made it into a billboard. So we were going from Vaduz to Feldkirch for dinner every night because the food was less expensive and better, actually. And we come back and said, wait a minute. So we backed up. It was a billboard. It said, Gary Kuehn, between sex and geometry. Was raining a little bit. We all jumped out of the car, stood on the platform, and had our picture taken in front of the title. Yeah, but I think to come back seriously to the subject, I think that's where it all plays out between sex and geometry, and that really sums up my interest, sex in the broadest sense, and geometry in its most eternal sense, and yeah, I mean, we can be more specific, but I think it's about, one is about control and rationality, the other is about passion and loss of control.
Yeah,
So,
I think this is a good moment to open up the discussion for the audience. So I take this for the Zoom, but maybe there is someone in the audience who would like to come into join our discussion. Yes, please.
I would like to know a little bit more about how it was actually to do art in the 60s and 70s. As you mentioned, it's a smaller community of artists in a smaller art world, and how people reacted, and the audience especially, in a time where minimalism was something really new and to some degree provocative.
Could you speak
maybe.
a little bit more loud if we can?
here's the other thing.
Oh, you didn't hear? No?
I'm really severely hearing impaired, so maybe I'll have to get the question through Dorothea, but go ahead, I'll try it.
Yeah, so if you could tell a little bit about how it was to be an artist in the 60s and 70s, in a time where modern art was really new and to some degree provocative, you know. I would love to know more about that aspect. Because today we're in a time where everything is possible, and I think that was really different then. It's very fascinating to me, this period of minimal art.
Is this about working outside the box and extending beyond the notion of painting and sculpture in the usual sense? Is that?
Yeah, and how was the resonance? How was your audience? I mean, who were interested in seeing what you were doing? Wasn't this rather small audience?
Very small audience, but I really appreciate your question because it comes to something that we didn't really touch on, and I had to deal with as a young artist. I worked with, and I was friends with, and respected what they were doing. These Fluxus, Performance, Capro, and Bob Watts, and so forth. It wasn't for me somehow. I started to think, I jump ahead. There was an exhibition in New York, I don't know when, in the 80s sometime, called Extremes, and it focused on artists who were willing to do anything to they would maybe say push the envelope, but get it out of the intense sphere of competition with other artists. So I'd say Chris Burden getting himself shot, Schwarzkugler cutting his penis off so he gets on the cover of Art Forum Marina Abramovic laying on a block of ice with a fire thing. It doesn't. Art has. It needs resistance. It needs to be part of a tradition, which also needs to be pushed, no question. But when it comes to this, I would say there's nothing more radical than to make a good easel painting. You know, it goes forward. Or as a professor, I would have students that they run around the school naked. I would say, come on, if you want to make a name this way, you got to do better than that. Everybody's willing at some point to run around naked. It's not, you can't, you know, this is not the space program. It's more confined, and it's more restricted, and you know, I'll say we have less freedom. There's less freedom to be had than we think. Yeah. And that's somehow the point. You have to be willing to fight your battle in the arena. You can't, you know, you can't take it out somewhere else where it needs resistance. Thank you for the question, though. That's a really smart question.
Thank you very much for the really great talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask just one. You just mentioned, and Dorothea mentioned, a couple of other artists, and apart from your teachers at Rutgers, and later on in life, did you consider your colleagues or other artists mainly as colleagues or as competitors? And was there a sort of extended dialogue with any of them? I mean, an active and conscious dialogue?
The contact with your colleagues at the time, was it more a contact of...
No, yeah,
competitive context, or rather a dialogue?
Yeah, okay, I get. You know what? It is so lonely. It is such a lonely business to be an artist, because you start out, your friends, and you go to a bar and you drink beer and you talk about art problems, but the further you get, the more isolated you are, the more the discipline that you choose for yourself narrows what you can do. There's less you can do. It gets more and more difficult, and you're more and more lonely. I don't have any friends. I have my wife's friends, writers. There are no artists that, I mean, there are a lot of artists I really, really, really respect, but you know, they're also not out drinking beer talking about art. You know, they're home. They're in their studio doing their work. So yeah, it's really brutal in that sense, and not the least bit glamorous. There's nothing glamorous about being an artist after you're out of art school and past a certain point. It's just, you know, you get yourself hooked, and I burned all my bridges. What else can I do?
So here we have another question. If there are no more questions so far, then I put one in from the Zoom that says, thanks for the wonderful talk. What are your thoughts about being connected very often to the terms of minimal and so-called post-minimal art? And how was it to collaborate with Lucy Lippert on the Eccentric Abstraction exhibition, from today's perspective, one of the key exhibitions of the time?
Well, the first thing I'd say, nobody collaborates with Lucy Lippert. She was a tough cookie and a tyrant. She knew exactly what she was looking for. She did tell me when I spoke to her, she said, I went to all the galleries in New York, spoke to all the dealers. She said, there was only one person who understood what I was getting at and what I thought the issue was, and that was Richard, the gallerist, Richard Bellamy, who was a terrible businessman, but a visionary in terms of discovering art. That Dick Bellamy was the only person who but she already had the same list that Bellamy would have given her. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's the same with when attitudes become form. Mm-hmm. If you look in the catalog, the front cover, the title page is Simon's address book, and you look next to your name, and if it says Bellamy, I'm very proud of the fact that next to Kuehn is Bellamy. That means Harold got my name from Dick Bellamy, and that's Richard Serra. It was.
And the first part of the question was, how do you feel about being connected with minimal art and post-minimal art? Is this a label you can accept for yourself?
It's a label that seems irrelevant. I mean, I think the time is, we don't have enough time to deal with this, because I think it's a real subject. The dynamic of the time required that as a solution, as a resolution of the impasse of abstract art, abstract expressionist art, and the fact that the formal tradition, there was not really room for any players. I mean, I think Judd's work is really great, the end, on one point, but I couldn't see anything to do in that direction. I think he's one of those artists who establishes a parameter, and then after that it becomes a subject for debate. Where the other parameters, and I'm not sure where the parameters are now, or if that paradigm even exists anymore. I just want to say one more thing that's slightly related to that. The last 15 years that I taught, I was already way past 65, and when I taught, and students would come in and want to know what I wanted them to do. I would say sometimes, I want you to choose another field because you don't belong here. But I would always put the question, I'm 82, you're 22, it's your world. You have to, my old model works for me. I can still do it. I have an identity here. My red thread didn't run out so far. I just can keep doing what I'm doing. So at the end of my teaching career, in a very supportive way, I don't mean that I was not tough about it, but all I could offer you was as a professor, was my knowledge, my own education, formal and gathered over a lifetime. But I can't teach you anything. I have no idea what I would teach you.
One question. What about art povera for you?
Arte povera.
Arte povera.
Yeah, I think they're like hand in glove. I feel really comfortable with work, and the only differences are cultural and background and so forth. But no, I think I'm interested in this art. I feel close to these artists, and I'll always go see an exhibition from this group.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful conversation. One thing that came out of it for me is this balance maybe between art as an individual pursuit, something that's deeply personal and psychological, and art as something that's a social pursuit, something that speaks to larger cultural concerns. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how this balance has played out in your own work? Do you think consciously about the relationship between what you want to pursue as an individual and how it speaks to society, or do you feel that it's a kind of unconscious balancing act in your work?
Okay,
Did
dear.
you get this? I think you have to repeat this yourself more pronounced and loud.
Okay. I'm interested in the relationship between the individual and the social in your work. Art, on the one hand, as an individual pursuit, very personal, psychological, but on the other hand, relating to larger cultural concerns.
The individual and the social, what's the connection in your, the relation in your work?
Yeah, I understand that part. I think, I mean, I would say it's coming from the individual, but the intention is social, instructional, and I hope, you know, my dream is that on some level it's universal. I don't ever see the things I do as representative of me. That's the last thing I'm interested in. So I would say to the first part of your question, I see it as social, but it's a tricky question because you have to ask then the question: does the world need art? You know what I mean? It's a tricky.
Does the world need artists? Yeah. I mean, of course, I think they do.
I mean, if you talk about revolutions, I don't think it's better to have a gun than a sculpture.
So maybe we come to an easier question here from the Zoom audience. How was the reaction on the melting geometric pieces? How is irony a part of your work? You know,
That's a good question.
This is a good question. Yeah. Well, now's a good time for the construction story, which we didn't ask.
Voila.
They got the question anyway. Dorothea always likes this experience I had when I was working. It sounds funny. I was teaching, but I would get an adjunct teaching job, and the university liked me because I never was asking for the job. I just was, excuse me for saying it, the best in the group, and I could deal with the class. So I would get a class to teach, and then I belonged to these strong unions, and so if I had a class, I just would call the union and say, get me a replacement for the day, and I would teach my class. But so that's the background why you have to explain. I have to explain why I did both and simultaneously. Anyway, I was working on a project it was absorbed by something else. It was Bell Telephone, probably became like Verizon or something in America now. They had extreme construction standards. So I was working in New Jersey on this site, and it wasn't even my unions that were doing it. They had a huge concrete wall, and it's built as it is here with wooden forms. And then when they pour the concrete, it has to be a monolithic pour. You can't fill it halfway and then fill it the next day. So 100 trucks are lined up with concrete, and there's this, as long as this building. And the form is, I don't know what it was for really. It was not my union. The trucks are pouring the concrete. It's a little bit on the hillside. And this was happening the whole day, hours and hours and hours of huge trucks just dumping their concrete, leaving like ants coming along at the next one. Somebody made a miscalculation and the form broke at the bottom. And the building was on a hillside, and so the concrete, tons and tons and tons of concrete like Las Palmas right now, like Canary Islands. It's just coming out over the landscape. It was so spectacular, and it was so clear, this idea. I didn't invent this idea, I saw it.
Yeah, here it is.
That's a version of it.
Yeah,
That's a really
it's
good
one
one,
of these melted.
but it gave me the idea. Then you play around with the fact that you have a material that's liquid and then it becomes solid. Did I answer your question? I forgot the question. I got carried away with the story.
The question was, and if I may answer my opinion, so is there any irony in these works? And I would say no. There's nothing ironic about things melting. I mean, I don't see irony in these works. This is a severe thing, that this solid form loses shape in a way. This is more, it's more tragic, or it's more, and maybe we come...
Yeah, I don't think the contractors saw it as ironic either. but it really opened things up. So if you talk about sex and geometry, this is, that's another way to come at that. It's I would say I learned so much from that, and I'm always thankful for the time that I was doing this construction work, because I was young enough to withstand the rigors of it. But it was that was an example of something that I saw in terms of. What was the other part of your question again?
No, I think this is now perfectly answered with this anecdote. And maybe, Michael, this is the last question, because then we have to come to an end. But please.
What was the reaction when you saw the concrete leaking out of the bottom? Did you laugh, or were you upset?
I was delighted. I thought it was delightful. When the best laid plans of mice and men go awry, you have to be in awe of the forces of nature, the greater powers, and so forth. It was delightful.
Yeah, I think we really have to come to an end here. And I would, if I should sum up your work to one sentence, I would conclude the way that Barrett started. Once again, your wonderful quote, what it's really about is how many things can fall apart and what holds things together. I think this is the shortest and best form to put it. And
thank all of you.